So for my research project, I did it on the Gwangju uprising, and specifically, I wanted to look at what motivated students and citizens in Gwangju to participate in the uprising. For context, the uprising lasted from May 18th to May 27th, 1980, and consisted of massive pro-democracy demonstrations against Chun Do-hwan and his government, as well as against the violence that paratroopers used on young people and students in the early days of the uprising. Park Chung-hee was assassinated in 1979, which launched a period of political instability in South Korea, and South Koreans believed that they were finally going to be able to have democracy, but that was not the case because of Chun Do-hwan. He launched a military coup in December of 1979, and democracy was not on his list of priorities. Gwangju was not unique in having protests in the spring of 1980. In fact, there were protests all over South Korea, but Gwangju was unique in how the government dealt with these protests. Chun Do-hwan sent special force paratroopers that were not trained in interacting with civilians to subdue otherwise peaceful protests. Young people were initially targeted because they might have been students that participated in previous demonstrations. Young people were dragged off buses, students were stabbed with bayonets, shot, had tear gas used on them, and were also beaten. The injured and the deceased were thrown onto trucks and taken out of Gwangju. Here's a video from the K-drama Youth of May, released in 2021, about the Gwangju uprising. Obviously fictional.
야, 대학생 새끼를 다 끌어내려! 야, 너 뭐야?
저 대학생 아니에요. 신분 좀 보여드릴 테니까.
따라와.
이거 나예요. 저 대학생 아니라니까.
아니, 말로 하니까. 너 내가 만만해? 어? 이 새끼가.
Ooh, cliffhanger. If you want to know what happens, I guess you have to watch it. Instead of subduing protests, paratroopers' violence actually widened the scope of protests. And so on May 19th, non-students, university faculty, like high schoolers and others, people like that, started to join. At its max, there were 200,000 to 300,000 people that were marching in the streets. And for a city of 700,000 people at the time, this was extremely significant. To summarize, students were initially motivated to protest because of Chun Do-hwan and the lack of democracy. But the catalyst for non-student participation in protests was witnessing the extreme violence that was directed towards young people on May 18th. Even on the last day of the uprising, which was in the early morning of May 27th, people stood their ground in the final battle because they wanted to finish what they had started. What had developed was a Gwangju spirit, in which people from all walks of life recognized that the injustices and violence committed by the government and stood together against it. Not everyone held a gun or fought with soldiers, but everyone that could participated in meaningful ways, which included handing food to protesters and donating blood to hospitals. People in Gwangju viewed standing up for democracy as being more important than allowing atrocities committed by their own government to go unrecognized.